By the time Daniel Brooks walked into that mansion, he had already lost almost everything. His wife was gone. His savings were gone. And the only thing he had left in this world was an 8-year-old daughter who still believed her father could fix anything. That night he wasn't there for money. He wasn't there for pity. He came to say goodbye to the only man who had ever shown him kindness when his whole world fell apart. But standing in a room filled with diamonds, champagne, and people worth more than entire neighborhoods, Daniel became the easiest person to laugh at. Then the billionaire's daughter looked at him, pointed to her late father's rusty old car, and smiled. "Take it," she said. "It's probably worth more to you than it is to me." And just like that, the entire room laughed. What none of them knew was that hidden beneath the rust was a secret her father had protected for decades. And in less than a week, that worthless car would turn a broke single dad into the owner of a £5 million fortune. But the money, that wasn't the real twist. Because what Richard Ashford left inside that car would expose the daughter he never truly trusted and change Daniel's life forever. Daniel Brooks was 38 years old. But grief had a way of making him look older. Not because life had been cruel all at once, but because it had been cruel slowly, quietly, in the kind of way that doesn't break you in a single day, but wears you down piece by piece until even smiling starts to feel like work. 3 years earlier, Daniel had buried his wife, Emily. Cancer had taken her in less than 8 months. And ever since that day, the world had stopped feeling like a place he belonged in. But he didn't have the luxury of falling apart. Because every morning, before the sun rose over the cracked rooftops of his neighborhood, there was a little girl waiting for him in the next room. Her name was Lily. 8 years old. Bright eyes, messy ponytail, and a smile so much like her mother's that some mornings, Daniel had to look away just to keep himself from breaking down. Lily was the only reason he still got up at 5 a.m. The only reason he kept moving when his body begged him to stop. The only reason he could still look at the future and see something worth fighting for. Every day, Daniel lived the same exhausting routine. He'd wake up before dawn in the tiny rented house they could barely afford. The paint on the walls was peeling. The kitchen sink leaked. And in winter, the heater worked only when it felt like it. But somehow, Daniel always found a way to make it feel like home. He'd stand in that small kitchen flipping pancakes on a scratched old pan, pretending they were a special breakfast and not just the cheapest thing he could make with what was left in the cupboard. Lily would sit at the table in her school uniform, swinging her legs under the chair, smiling like she didn't notice how tired her father looked. "Daddy," she asked, "when I grow up, can I buy you a big house with a garage and a garden?" And Daniel, no matter how exhausted he was, no matter how badly his heart ached, would smile and say, "You won't have to, sweetheart, things won't always be this hard." But the truth was, Daniel didn't know if that was a promise to Lily, or a lie he kept telling himself just to survive. By day, he worked as a mechanic in a small repair shop on the edge of town. Oil-stained hands, long hours, back bent over engines that belonged to people who often had more money in their glove compartment than he had in his bank account. By night, after the garage closed, he delivered food across the city in whatever borrowed or half-repaired vehicle he could get running. Sometimes he didn't get home until after midnight. Sometimes he skipped dinner so Lily could have a full plate. Sometimes he sat alone in the car between deliveries, staring at old photos of Emily on his phone, wondering how much longer he could keep pretending he was okay. And yet, for all the things Daniel had lost, bitterness was never one of them. If a neighbor's car broke down and they couldn't afford repairs, Daniel fixed it anyway. If an elderly woman on the block needed groceries carried inside, he did it without being asked. If Lily's classmates needed help with a school fundraiser, Daniel was the first parent to show up, even if he had grease on his hands and only $20 in his wallet. People in the neighborhood respected him. Not because he had money. Not because life had been kind to him. But because somehow, after all the pain he had endured, Daniel Brooks still chose to be good. Still chose to be gentle. Still chose to help people. still chose to believe that being poor didn't mean you had to stop being generous. And maybe that was what made his story so heartbreaking. Because the world is full of men who become cruel when life crushes them. But Daniel became softer. He carried grief in one hand, and hope in the other. And he did it all for one little girl who still believed her father could fix anything. What Daniel didn't know was that in just a few days, his life was about to collide with a world so far removed from his own. A world of billionaires, private estates, and old money. And in that world, a joke meant to humiliate him would become the miracle that changed everything. If Daniel Brooks lived in a world of overdue bills, sleepless nights, and second chances held together by faith, Richard Ashford had lived in the exact opposite one. For more than 4 decades, Richard Ashford's name had meant power. The kind of power that didn't need to shout because everyone in the room already knew who owned it. He was one of those rare men whose wealth had become legend. Billionaire investor, industrial empire owner, collector of things so rare most people only ever saw them in museums or magazines. He owned homes in 3 countries. A private jet that carried him across continents like distance meant nothing. Companies that employed thousands. And perhaps most famously of all, a classic car collection so valuable, so exclusive that automobile enthusiasts called it the crown jewel of the private collector world. Cars that had once belonged to royalty. Prototype vehicles the public had never even seen. Hand-built machines worth more than entire neighborhoods. To the outside world, Richard Ashford looked like a man who had everything. But death has a way of proving that even money has limits. And on a gray autumn morning, the man who had spent his entire life building an empire was lowered into the ground while the city's wealthiest families stood in black suits and dark sunglasses pretending grief could be measured by the price of flowers. His funeral was held on the grounds of the Ashford estate. An estate almost felt like too small a word for it. It was less a home and more a kingdom. A sprawling mansion surrounded by iron gates, marble fountains, acres of manicured land, and a private garage so large it looked more like an automotive museum than a place to park cars. Luxury sedans lined the driveway. Waiters in white gloves moved silently through the halls carrying crystal glasses and trays of champagne. Politicians, CEOs, investors, and old money socialites filled the reception rooms, whispering condolences between business deals and inheritance gossip. And then there was Daniel, standing in a suit that wasn't quite new anymore. Shoes polished the night before at his kitchen table. Hands rough from years of engine oil and hard labor. A man so visibly out of place that even before he spoke, people had already decided he didn't belong there. But Daniel hadn't come for the champagne, or the chandeliers, or the spectacle of watching rich people mourn one of their own. He came because years earlier, when his wife Emily died and his world collapsed under the weight of hospital bills, funeral costs, and a grief he didn't know how to carry, Richard Ashford had done something no one else had done. He had noticed him. Daniel had once repaired a vintage Mercedes for one of Ashford's estate managers. Richard happened to be there that day. He saw the way Daniel worked, careful, honest, meticulous, and struck up a conversation. A week later, Richard somehow learned about Emily's death. And then, without cameras, without press, without expecting anything in return, he quietly paid off a portion of Daniel's medical debt and made sure Lily's school fees were covered for a year. No speeches. No public generosity. No self-congratulation. Just a simple note that arrived with the payment. A good man should not have to carry every burden alone. Daniel never forgot that. In a world where kindness often came with conditions, Richard Ashford had offered his with none. Which is why Daniel stood there now, surrounded by wealth he could never imagine, grieving a man he had only met a handful of times, yet somehow respected more than most people he'd known his whole life. But funerals have a strange way of revealing the people left behind. And as the final guests moved from the graveside to the memorial reception, all eyes slowly turned toward the one person who now owned everything Richard Ashford had spent a lifetime building. Victoria Ashford, 30 years old. Elegant, beautiful, impeccably dressed. The only child of one of the richest men in the country. Overnight she inherited it all. The mansion. The companies. The art. The private jet. The fortune. And of course the cars. Enough wealth to buy almost anything she could ever want. But where Richard Ashford had carried his power with quiet restraint, Victoria wore hers like a weapon. She didn't smile at people. She assessed them, measured them, dismissed them. Her grief, if it existed at all, was hidden beneath polished makeup and the cold, practiced expression of someone who had spent her entire life being told the world belonged to her. Employees lowered their eyes when she walked past. Guests laughed too quickly at her dry remarks. And every room she entered seemed to tighten under the weight of her presence. She had her father's name, his money, his empire, but not his heart. And before the day was over, Daniel Brooks would learn just how dangerous that difference could be. Because somewhere inside that mansion, hidden beneath dust, rust, and years of neglect, sat an old car Victoria considered worthless. A car her father had never sold, never displayed, never explained. And in just a matter of hours, she was going to hand it away like garbage to the one man her father may have trusted more than his own daughter. After the memorial service ended, the atmosphere inside the Ashford estate began to change. The tears faded, the sympathy softened, and grief, at least for most of the people in that mansion, quietly gave way to curiosity. Because while Richard Ashford was gone, the empire he left behind was still very much alive. Guests drifted from the reception hall toward the private garage wing of the estate, that legendary collection people had whispered about for years. And when the doors opened, the room fell into the kind of silence only money can create. There they were. Rows of polished machines gleaming beneath soft overhead lights like sculptures in a museum. A deep black Rolls-Royce with chrome so perfect it looked untouched by time. A vintage Bentley with hand-stitched leather interiors and a price tag that could have bought Daniel's entire street. Ferraris in impossible shades of red, lined up like they belonged in a billionaire's dream rather than a private home. Everywhere Daniel looked, there was wealth. Not the kind you work for with sore hands and sleepless nights. The kind that lives behind glass. The kind that gets admired, insured, and passed down through bloodlines. People circled the cars with champagne glasses in hand, murmuring about horsepower, rarity, auction value. Some spoke about the collection with more emotion than they had shown at Richard's funeral. Daniel stood quietly near the back, hands in his coat pockets, saying nothing. He wasn't there to admire luxury. He wasn't there to pretend he understood a world where one car could cost more than everything he had earned in his lifetime. He was simply trying not to look out of place. But people like Daniel always stand out in rooms like that. Not because they're loud, but because poverty has a way of making silence feel visible. Victoria noticed him almost immediately. She had been entertaining a small crowd of guests, moving through the garage with the confidence of someone who had never once had to wonder what things cost. And then her eyes landed on Daniel, the mechanic in the worn suit, standing awkwardly among collectors and millionaires. A small smile touched her lips. Not a kind one. The kind of smile people wear when they've just found something to amuse themselves with. "Come with me," she said, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. Daniel hesitated, then followed as Victoria led the group past the polished showroom floor, beyond the gleaming Bentleys and pristine Ferraris, toward the far back corner of the garage where the lights were dimmer and the air smelled of dust. And there, hidden beneath an old canvas cover and years of neglect, sat a car no one had paid attention to all afternoon. It was ugly, at least at first glance. Its body was buried under rust. The paint had almost completely faded. The chrome was dull. One tire looked half flat. Dust coated the windshield so thickly, it barely reflected light at all. Compared to the masterpieces in the main garage, it looked less like part of a billionaire's collection and more like something abandoned behind a junkyard decades ago. Victoria let out a short laugh. "Dad loved junk," she said. A few guests chuckled politely. She stepped closer to the car and ran one manicured finger across the rusted hood, then turned toward Daniel with a look that was half amusement, half cruelty. "You're a mechanic, right?" Daniel nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." Victoria smiled. It wasn't warmth. It was performance. "Well," she said, folding her arms, "you should take this one." Daniel blinked, not sure he had heard her correctly. Victoria gestured toward the rusted car as if she were offering him leftovers after a party. "Go on," she said, "it's all yours." A few people exchanged glances. Someone laughed. Then another. And suddenly the entire moment shifted. It wasn't generosity. It was entertainment. A billionaire heiress handing a rusty old wreck to the poorest man in the room, and everyone around them understood the joke instantly. She wasn't giving Daniel a gift. She was reminding him where he stood. "You could probably use it more than we can," Victoria added, her voice smooth and careless. "Unless, of course, it's too much of an upgrade." The group around her burst into laughter. Not loud, uncontrolled laughter. The polished kind. The expensive kind. The kind people use when they want to stay on the good side of someone rich. Daniel felt every pair of eyes in the room land on him. And for a moment he just stood there. A grown man. A father. A husband once. A person who had buried the love of his life, worked himself to exhaustion, and done everything in his power to stay decent in a world that rarely rewarded decency. And now he was being laughed at like a punchline. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because he was poor enough to be funny. His face burned with humiliation. His throat tightened. And for one brief second, he considered walking away. But Daniel had spent too many years swallowing pride to survive. So instead, he looked at Victoria, gave the smallest nod he could manage, and said the only thing dignity would allow him to say. "Thank you." The laughter faded into murmurs as he stepped toward the car. No argument. No anger. No scene. Just a quiet man accepting a cruel joke with more grace than anyone in that room deserved. Later that evening, after arranging for the car to be towed and signing a few transfer papers Victoria barely bothered to read, Daniel drove the old rust bucket home. The engine coughed. The steering shook. And the whole thing rattled like it might fall apart before it reached the end of the street. But when he pulled into the driveway of his tiny rented house, something happened that no one in that mansion would have expected. Lily came running out the front door in her socks, her eyes lighting up the second she saw it. "Daddy," she shouted, "whose car is that?" Daniel gave a tired smile. "Ours, apparently." Lily gasped like he had just parked a spaceship outside their home. She ran around the car in circles, touching the rusted doors, peeking through the dusty windows, completely blind to the dents, the peeling paint, the embarrassment attached to how it had been given. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Daniel almost laughed. Beautiful was the last word anyone at the Ashford estate would have used. But Lily didn't see an old wreck. She saw possibility. She climbed into the passenger seat, grinning from ear to ear, and said, "Can we fix it together?" And just like that, something inside Daniel softened. Because maybe the rich had laughed when they gave it to him. Maybe Victoria Ashford had meant it as a joke. But sitting there under the dim porch light, with his daughter smiling beside him like he had brought home treasure instead of trash. For the first time that night, Daniel didn't feel humiliated. He felt curious. What he still didn't know was that hidden beneath the rust, the dust, and decades of silence was a secret powerful enough to change everything. And the joke Victoria Ashford made in front of that garage was about to become the most expensive mistake of her life. The next morning, Daniel Brooks did what he always did when life handed him something broken. He rolled up his sleeves, grabbed his tools, and got to work. To anyone else, the car sitting in his driveway looked like a joke that had gone too far. Its once proud body was buried beneath layers of rust and dust. The tires were worn. The paint had almost vanished. The leather inside had cracked with age. And every time Daniel touched the hood, tiny flakes of corrosion came away in his hands like the car was quietly disintegrating after decades of being forgotten. But Daniel had spent most of his life around machines people had given up on. He knew that sometimes the ugliest things carried the best stories. And sometimes what looked dead was simply waiting for someone patient enough to listen. So while Lily sat on an upside-down bucket beside him, happily handing him wrenches she could barely pronounce, Daniel began the slow process of bringing the old car back to life. He vacuumed years of dust from the seats. He cleaned the dashboard inch by inch. He loosened bolts that looked like they hadn't been touched since before Lily was born. He removed panels, checked the wiring, drained the old fluids, and carefully inspected every part of the engine like he was trying to understand not just how the car worked, but why Richard Ashford had kept it hidden away from the rest of his collection. At first, it seemed exactly what Victoria believed it was. A rusting relic. An old forgotten classic with too many problems and too little value. But then Daniel started noticing things that didn't fit. The first was the engraving. It was small, almost invisible beneath years of grime, tucked near the inside frame of the driver's door. A symbol, not a logo he recognized, not a manufacturer's stamp he had seen before. Just a strange hand-etched mark, followed by a number sequence that looked far too deliberate to be random. Daniel frowned and ran his thumb across it again. Then he found the second oddity. Behind the glove compartment was a shallow hidden panel that shouldn't have been there at all. Inside it sat a folded scrap of yellowed paper, brittle with age, covered in handwritten notes he could barely make out. Measurements, initials, a date from decades earlier. And at the bottom, underlined twice, a phrase that made no sense to him. Prototype 3 never release. Daniel stared at the note for a long moment. Prototype. He pulled back and looked at the car differently now. Not like a mechanic. Like a man standing in front of a locked door he didn't yet realize he had just begun to open. Over the next few hours, the questions only multiplied. A strange serial number stamped near the chassis that didn't match the make or model on record. A hidden compartment beneath the passenger side floorboard. Tiny details in the bodywork that looked handmade rather than factory-produced. Metal components that seemed too advanced for the era the car supposedly came from. Nothing about it made sense. And Daniel had worked on enough cars to know when something was off. By evening, curiosity had turned into unease. He sat at the kitchen table after Lily went to bed, the old handwritten notes spread out beside him, his laptop open, searching every classic car archive, restoration forum, and collector's database he could find. Nothing matched. The symbol didn't match. The serial number didn't match. The body design looked familiar, but not identical to anything on public record. It was as if the car existed, but also didn't. And that was the moment Daniel decided this was bigger than him. The next day, he reached out to a man named Arthur Bellamy, a respected classic car historian and restoration expert whose work had been featured in museums, auctions, and automotive documentaries across Europe. Arthur had spent 30 years studying rare collector vehicles. If anyone could identify what was sitting in Daniel's driveway, it was him. Daniel sent him photos. The engraving. The note. The serial number. The unusual bodywork. Then he waited. An hour passed. Nothing. 2 hours. Still nothing. By the end of the afternoon, Daniel started to assume the whole thing had been a waste of time. Maybe the car was just an old custom build. Maybe Richard Ashford had hidden it because it held sentimental value and nothing more. Maybe Daniel was simply reading mystery into a pile of rust because life had taught him to hope for miracles he rarely received. Then his phone rang. Arthur Bellamy. Daniel answered immediately. Hello. At first, all he heard was silence. Not the silence of bad reception. The silence of someone trying to process what they've just seen. Then Arthur finally spoke. And his voice had changed. It was quieter now. Less certain. Almost shaken. Daniel, he said slowly, where exactly did you get this car? Daniel frowned. It belonged to a late collector. Why? Another pause. Then Arthur exhaled sharply, like a man who had just realized he was standing in front of something history had buried on purpose. Because if these markings are real, he said, this can't be what I think it is. Daniel gripped the phone tighter. What do you mean? Arthur's answer came in almost a whisper. This isn't just an old classic. A beat. This is one of the Ashcroft Valemont prototypes. Daniel said nothing. He had never heard the name before. But Arthur had. And the way he said it made Daniel feel the room shift around him. Arthur explained that in the late 1970s, a small British luxury manufacturer had secretly commissioned 3 experimental prototype cars, vehicles designed with technology and engineering so far ahead of their time that they were meant to redefine the future of high-end performance motoring. But the project collapsed before the prototypes were publicly unveiled. The company went under. The records disappeared. And according to collectors, all 3 cars were either dismantled, lost, or destroyed. For over 40 years, the prototypes had become something of a myth in the collector world. People talked about them the way treasure hunters talk about lost gold. Everyone knew the story. No one believed any of the cars still existed. Arthur's voice dropped even lower. Daniel, if this really is prototype 3. He stopped, as if even saying it out loud felt absurd. Then he finished the sentence Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. You may be sitting on one of the rarest cars in the world. Daniel looked out through the kitchen window at the rusted shell parked under the weak yellow porch light. The same car Victoria Ashford had laughed at. The same car a room full of millionaires had treated like trash. The same car Lily had called beautiful. And for the first time, Daniel understood why Richard Ashford never displayed it. Why it had been hidden in the shadows of that garage. Why something about it had felt wrong from the very beginning. Because it had never been junk. It had been a secret. A secret worth more than Daniel could even imagine. And in that moment, with his heart pounding and Arthur Bellamy still breathing heavily on the other end of the line, Daniel Brooks realized that the cruel joke meant to humiliate him was about to become the discovery that changed his life forever. Once Arthur Bellamy confirmed what Daniel might be sitting on, the world changed almost overnight. What had spent decades hidden beneath rust in the back corner of a billionaire's garage suddenly became the kind of story money couldn't ignore. At first it was just whispers. A few calls between collectors. An email passed quietly from one restoration expert to another. A grainy photo of the chassis number sent to a private buyer's network in London. Then a second opinion. Then a third. And within 48 hours, the secret Richard Ashford had protected for decades was no longer a secret at all. The missing prototype had been found. One of only 3 ever built. The one collectors believed had been destroyed. The one people in the automotive world had spent 40 years talking about like it was folklore. Now it had a location. A name attached to it. And a stunned single father standing beside it in a rented driveway, still trying to process the fact that the rusted wreck he'd been mocked for taking home might be worth more money than he would make in 10 lifetimes. News spread fast. Automotive blogs picked it up first. Then collector magazines. Then auction houses. Then mainstream media. By the end of the week, Daniel's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Luxury dealers wanted meetings. Private collectors wanted photos. Investors wanted first refusal. One European buyer offered 7 figures before the car had even been officially authenticated. Daniel ignored most of them. Because this wasn't just overwhelming. It was terrifying. For a man who had spent the last 3 years worrying about rent, groceries, and school uniforms, the idea of suddenly holding something worth millions didn't feel exciting. It felt dangerous. He barely slept. Every knock at the door made him tense. Every unknown number made his stomach tight. And every time he looked at Lily laughing in the living room, he felt the weight of a future he didn't yet know how to carry. In the end, Arthur Bellamy convinced him there was only one safe way to do this. A high-profile international auction. Transparent. Verified. Protected. If the car was truly what the experts believed it was, the right buyers would come. And they did. The auction was held in London just 8 days after Victoria Ashford had laughed and handed Daniel the keys like she was tossing away scrap metal. 8 days. That was all it took for Daniel Brooks' life to split into a before and an after. The room was unlike anything he had ever seen. A cathedral of wealth and quiet tension. Glass walls. Spotlights. Security at every entrance. Rows of suited bidders seated beneath giant screens displaying the history of the prototype in dramatic black and white photographs. Private representatives from Dubai, Monaco, New York, Geneva. Men and women who had spent their lives buying things most people only ever dream of touching. And at the center of it all, resting beneath soft white light, was the car. Not fully restored. Not polished into something unrecognizable. Just carefully preserved and authenticated, its rust and imperfections now treated not as flaws but as proof. Proof that it had survived. Proof that history had almost lost it. Proof that a billionaire heiress had accidentally given away one of the rarest vehicles on Earth. Daniel stood near the back of the room in a borrowed dark suit, hands clenched so tightly at his sides that his knuckles had gone pale. Beside him sat Lily, wearing a little navy dress and shoes she had insisted on polishing herself that morning. She looked around the room with wide eyes, still too young to fully understand what was happening, but old enough to sense that something enormous was about to change. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging lightly at his sleeve, "are all these people here for our car?" Daniel looked down at her and managed a faint smile. "Looks like it." But inside he could barely breathe. Because this wasn't really about the car anymore. It was about the years he had spent pretending things would somehow get better. The nights he skipped meals so Lily wouldn't have to. The bills he hid in drawers because he didn't want her to see how close they were to losing everything. The birthdays he tried to make magical with almost nothing in his pocket. The promise he made every morning in that tiny kitchen, things won't always be this hard. For the first time in a long time, that promise was standing on the edge of becoming true. Then the auctioneer stepped onto the stage. The room fell silent. A brief introduction. A summary of the prototype's history. Its disappearance. Its astonishing rediscovery. And then finally, the bidding began. "We'll open at £500,000. A paddle lifted instantly. 500,000. Another. 600. Then 7. 8. 9. Within seconds, the numbers were climbing faster than Daniel could process. 1 million. The room didn't even flinch. A bidder near the front raised his hand without changing expression. 1.2. 1.5. 1.8. Daniel stared at the screen as if the figures might rearrange themselves into something more believable. Lily reached for his hand. He held it tightly. Then came the first real jolt. £2 million. A murmur moved through the room. Not because the number was shocking to the bidders, but because it meant the impossible was now undeniable. The rusted old car from Daniel's driveway. The one Victoria Ashford had laughed at in front of a room full of millionaires. Had just crossed into a world where money no longer felt real. But it still wasn't over. Another bidder entered. Then another. The price surged again. 2.5. 2.8. 3 million. This time even the room reacted. A few heads turned. Pens stopped moving. Whispers rippled through the rows of collectors. Daniel felt his chest tighten. £3 million. He thought of Emily. Of the hospital room. Of the machines. Of the bills that arrived after the funeral like grief itself hadn't already cost enough. He thought of Lily's school shoes with the worn soles. The landlord's final warning letter sitting, unopened in a drawer at home. The way his daughter smiled every time he promised life would get easier, even when he wasn't sure he believed it himself. And suddenly, this room full of millionaires didn't feel glamorous anymore. It felt surreal. Because all Daniel could see was a little girl at a kitchen table eating pancakes from a scratched old pan. The bidding slowed. Then jumped again. 3.4. 3.8. 4 million. A visible gasp moved through the room now. Even seasoned collectors leaned forward. Arthur Bellamy, seated a few rows ahead, had gone completely still. Then came the battle that changed everything. A private collector from Switzerland. A luxury museum representative from the Middle East. A British automotive investor bidding through an agent in the second row. The numbers rose in brutal, elegant increments. 4.2. 4.4. 4.6. Daniel's breathing turned shallow. Lily looked up at him. "Daddy, are you okay?" He nodded, but tears had already begun to gather in his eyes. Because he wasn't watching a car being sold anymore. He was watching every fear he had carried for years begin to loosen its grip. He was watching Lily's future unfold in real time. A safe home. A proper education. A life where she would never have to count coins at the grocery store or hear her father pretending not to be worried. Then the final bid came. The auctioneer lifted his chin, voice cutting through the silence like a blade. £5 million. The room froze. No one moved. No new paddle rose. The auctioneer looked left. Then right. £5 million, fair warning. Daniel's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Last chance. He squeezed Lily's hand so tightly, he almost forgot where he was. Then, sold. The hammer came down. And just like that, it was over. £5 million. The number echoed through the room, but Daniel barely heard the applause that followed. He just stood there, staring at the stage, as if his mind refused to accept what had happened. Then his face crumpled. Not with pride. Not with shock. Not even with relief. But with the kind of grief that only shows up when suffering finally ends and your body doesn't know what to do with the silence. Daniel covered his mouth as tears spilled down his face. Because in that moment, the truth hit him all at once. Lily would be okay. No more unpaid rent. No more choosing between electricity and groceries. No more lying awake at night wondering what would happen to her if something happened to him. For the first time since Emily died, his daughter was safe. Lily wrapped both arms around him and held on as tightly as her little body could. And through tears, with the innocence only children still have, she whispered the one sentence that broke whatever strength Daniel had left. Mom would be proud. Daniel closed his eyes. And for a moment, in the middle of that room filled with wealth, cameras, and applause, none of it mattered. Not the collectors. Not the money. Not the headlines waiting to be writ. Just a father. A daughter. And the unbearable, beautiful realization that the life he had been fighting for had finally begun. But Daniel still didn't know the most important part. Because the £5 million car wasn't Richard Ashford's final gift. It was only the beginning. And hidden inside that vehicle was one last secret powerful enough to expose the truth about why Richard had kept it hidden in the first place. For most people in that auction room, the story should have ended the moment the hammer came down. A forgotten car. A shocking discovery. £5 million. It was already the kind of story newspapers love, dramatic, ironic, easy to headline. A billionaire's daughter mocks a poor mechanic. The junk turns out to be priceless. The underdog wins. Clean. Satisfying. Complete. But life rarely ends its most important stories at the point where the world stops watching. Because after the applause faded, after the paperwork began, and after Daniel had finally managed to wipe the tears from his face, someone found something else. It happened almost by accident. The auction organizers had arranged for one final inspection before the prototype was transferred to its new owner. Standard procedure. Documentation, authentication, photographs, internal condition checks, the sort of meticulous process that surrounds anything worth millions. One of the restoration specialists was examining the dashboard panel when he noticed the wood trim didn't sit quite flush. It was subtle, easy to miss. The kind of detail only someone obsessive would notice. He pressed gently against the edge. A small hidden compartment clicked open. Inside was an envelope. Old. Cream-colored. Sealed. And on the front, written in a steady hand that time hadn't quite erased, were 5 words. To whoever earns this car. The room changed instantly. The technicians stopped what they were doing. Arthur Bellamy stepped forward. Daniel stared at the envelope as if it might disappear if he blinked too hard. And standing only a few feet away, dressed in black and silent for the first time all evening, was Victoria Ashford. Someone carefully opened the letter. Inside was a single folded page. At the top, in unmistakable handwriting, was the name Daniel had come to honor at the funeral just days earlier. Richard Ashford. Arthur looked at Daniel once, then began to read aloud. "If you're reading this," he said quietly, "then you treated this car with kindness instead of greed." The room fell still. Even the soft background noise of the auction hall seemed to vanish. Arthur continued. Richard wrote that the car had never been forgot. Never abandoned. Never dismissed as worthless. He had hidden it intentionally. For years. Not because he wanted to keep its value secret from the world, but because he wanted to keep it secret from the wrong people. The prototype, Richard explained, was one of the rarest machines he had ever owned. He knew exactly what it was worth. He knew what collectors would pay for it. And he knew that if he ever revealed its true identity while he was alive, the people around him would only see one thing: money. So instead, he concealed it beneath rust, dust, and neglect. He let it look ugly. He let it look broken. He let it sit in the shadows while the polished cars took the spotlight. Because Richard Ashford wasn't just hiding a vehicle. He was hiding a test. Arthur's voice tightened as he read the next lines. Richard wrote that over the years, he had met countless people who admired his wealth but very few who respected the things beneath it. Too many people, he said, only knew how to value something once they were told its price. Too many saw beauty only after someone rich called it beautiful. Too many measured worth by appearance, status, and auction estimates. But every once in a while, a different kind of person came along. A person who could look at something worn down, overlooked, and dismissed by everyone else, and still treat it with care. Still see dignity in it. Still try to restore it instead of exploit it. And that, Richard wrote, was the kind of person he trusted. The letter went on. Years earlier, after Daniel had repaired a vehicle on the Ashford estate, Richard had quietly started asking questions about him. He learned about Emily. About the hospital bills. About Lily. About the nights Daniel worked until exhaustion and still found time to fix neighbors' cars for free. He learned that Daniel was the sort of man who stayed honest even when life gave him every excuse not to. The sort of man who would rather go without than take what didn't belong to him. The sort of man who, even in grief, still chose kindness. And then came the sentence that seemed to steal the air from the room. "If my daughter gives this car away carelessly," Arthur read, "and if the man receiving it chooses to restore it rather than sell it for scrap, then I will know I was right about both of them." Silence. No one moved. Daniel felt his chest tighten. Victoria's face had gone pale. Arthur lowered the page for a second, but Daniel could barely hear anything beyond the pounding in his own heartbeat. This had never been random. Never a mistake. Never a cruel twist of fate that accidentally worked in his favor. Richard Ashford had seen him. Long before the funeral. Long before the garage. Long before Victoria turned the car into a joke. He had seen Daniel's character when Daniel himself had nothing left to offer except honesty. Arthur resumed reading. Richard's final paragraphs were shorter. More personal. He wrote that wealth was easy to inherit but difficult to deserve. That he had spent his life building an empire only to realize too late that money can give your children comfort without ever teaching them humility. He wrote that his greatest fear was not dying. It was leaving behind a daughter who had learned the value of possessions, but not the value of people. And then near the bottom of the page came the final line. A line directed not to Daniel, but to Victoria. "If you are standing there when this letter is read, then perhaps this loss will teach you what my fortune never could, that the worth of a person is revealed by how they treat what they believe has no value." Arthur's voice fell away. No one spoke. Daniel looked across the room. Victoria Ashford stood frozen in place, her face stripped of every ounce of confidence she had carried like armor since her father's funeral. For the first time, she didn't look powerful. She looked exposed. Because in a single letter written by the one man whose opinion had mattered more to her than anyone else's, her father had said the one thing she could never argue with. He had trusted Daniel more than he trusted her. Not with a business deal. Not with a car. With his legacy. with the one possession he had hidden from the world. The one thing he knew would reveal the truth about whoever touched it. And Daniel, the widowed mechanic she mocked in front of a room full of rich strangers, had passed a test she never even knew existed. He hadn't looked at the car and seen quick money. He hadn't tried to exploit it. He hadn't tossed it aside because it looked ugly. He had cleaned it, studied it, protected it, treated it with patience and respect long before he knew it was worth anything at all. And in doing so, he had done something Victoria never expected. He had honored Richard Ashford more sincerely with a rusted old car than anyone else in that mansion had honored him with speeches, flowers, or tears. Daniel lowered his eyes, overwhelmed by a grief he hadn't anticipated. Because suddenly the money mattered less. What mattered was the fact that a man as powerful as Richard Ashford had looked at his life, his small, struggling, ordinary life, and seen something worthy in it. Something rare. Something worth trusting. And maybe, in a strange way, that was the true inheritance Richard left behind. Not the car. Not the auction. Not the fortune. But the proof that kindness, dignity, and humility still mean something in a world obsessed with appearances. And as Victoria stood there in stunned silence, staring at the letter her father had written from beyond the grave, she came face to face with a truth no amount of inherited wealth could soften. The poorest man in the room had been the richest where it mattered most. Money can change a life in a single moment. But what it does after that moment, that's what reveals who someone truly is. For Daniel Brooks, the £5 million wasn't the end of his story. It was the first time life finally gave him room to breathe. In the months that followed, the tiny rented house with peeling paint and a leaking sink became a memory Daniel would never forget, but one Lily would no longer have to grow up inside. He bought a home. Not a mansion. Not some oversized symbol of revenge or status. Just a warm, beautiful place with enough space for Lily to run through the backyard and enough peace to make it finally feel like life had stopped punishing them. For the first time in years, Daniel slept through the night. No landlord's threats. No panic over unpaid bills. No silent fear about what would happen to Lily if he ever got sick, or if the car broke down, or if one bad month pushed them over the edge. He made sure Lily's future was secure. Set money aside for her education. Created a savings account in Emily's name. And kept the promise he had whispered to his daughter so many mornings at that kitchen table. Things won't always be this hard. But Daniel did something else too. Something that proved Richard Ashford had chosen the right man all along. Because Daniel knew what it felt like to work yourself to exhaustion and still have nothing left. He knew what it felt like to raise a child while carrying grief in one hand and overdue bills in the other. He knew the humiliation of needing help and the pride that often keeps good people from asking for it. So instead of disappearing into comfort, Daniel turned his miracle into someone else's lifeline. 6 months after the auction, he opened a small automotive training center on the edge of the city. Not for wealthy collectors. Not for luxury clients. For struggling single parents. Men and women who had lost spouses. People trying to rebuild after divorce, debt, illness, or hardship. Mothers and fathers who needed a skill, a second chance, and a place where no one would look down on them for starting over. The sign outside the building was simple. BROKS Automotive Training Center. In memory of Emily Brooks and in honor of second chances. Inside, Daniel funded free classes in basic car repair, restoration, and mechanical work. He created scholarships. Paid for childcare during training sessions so parents could actually attend. Partnered with local garages to help graduates find jobs. And quietly covered emergency expenses for families who reminded him too much of the life he and Lily had once lived. Word spread. Not because Daniel wanted attention, but because people could feel the difference between generosity that performs and generosity that remembers. And then one morning, something happened Daniel never expected. Victoria Ashford walked through the doors. Not in designer black. Not flanked by assistants. Not with the cold, untouchable posture she wore like armor at her father's funeral. Just Victoria. Quiet. uncertain, holding a cardboard box full of donated tools in both hands. At first, the room seemed to pause around her. Because some people recognized her. Recognized the heiress from the headlines. The woman who had once handed away a rusty car like trash and accidentally gave away a fortune. Daniel saw her from across the workshop floor. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Victoria walked over and placed the box down gently on a workbench. "I wasn't sure if you'd want me here," she said. Her voice was softer now. Not polished. Not sharp. Just honest in a way Daniel had never heard before. Daniel looked at the tools. Then at her. "You came anyway," he said. Victoria gave the faintest nod. And in her eyes was something he hadn't seen at the estate or the auction or anywhere in between. Shame. But also understanding. Because for the first time in her life, Victoria Ashford had been forced to confront a truth money had protected her from for years. That inheritance can buy comfort. But it cannot buy character. That owning valuable things doesn't make you valuable. That her father had spent a lifetime trying to teach her something she was too privileged to hear while he was alive. And somehow, it took losing a £5 million car to understand the one lesson hidden beneath all his wealth. Real riches aren't measured by what you keep. They're measured by what you do when life finally gives you more than enough. Victoria started volunteering twice a week. At first it was awkward. She didn't know how to fit into a place built for people whose lives looked nothing like hers. She wasn't used to being uncomfortable. Wasn't used to not being the most important person in the room. But slowly something changed. She helped organize scholarship applications. Served coffee to exhausted parents arriving for evening classes. Sorted donated equipment. Read stories to children in the waiting room while their mothers and fathers learned how to rebuild engines in the next room. And little by little, the woman who once laughed at a rusted car began to understand why her father had hidden his greatest treasure beneath one. Because he was never trying to protect the car. He was trying to reveal the people around it. Months later, on a quiet afternoon, Daniel stood outside the training center watching Lily ride her bike across the parking lot, laughing in the golden light. For the first time in years, the future didn't look frightening. It looked open. And somewhere in that moment, in the sound of his daughter laughing, in the sight of struggling parents learning a trade inside the workshop, in the knowledge that one act of cruelty had somehow become hundreds of second chances, Daniel finally understood what Richard Ashford had really left him. Not just money. Meaning. A way to turn pain into purpose. Humiliation into healing. Loss into something that could still help other people live. And maybe that's why stories like this stay with us. Because on the surface, it's a story about a rusty old car and £5 million. But underneath, it's a story about the difference between having wealth and having worth. About the quiet dignity of a man who stayed kind when life gave him every reason not to. About a little girl who saw beauty in what the world called broken. And about a father who understood that the truest measure of a person is how they treat something when they believe it has no value at all. She thought she was giving away worthless scrap. But she accidentally handed a good man the greatest treasure her father ever left behind. Because the rarest thing in this world isn't a £5 million car. It's a heart that stays humble when life finally gives it everything. So now I want to ask you, if someone handed you an old rusty car, would you have laughed and walked away? Or would you have looked a little closer? Tell me in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more unforgettable stories about love, loss, second chances, and the hidden value people miss at first glance.